I'm Doug Wiley with Police Magazine. I'm here with my good friend Missy Lynn, an attorney who helps law enforcement officers not only in defending them, but also teaching them and training them. You have an interesting new crate. Tell us about the Crisis Communications Crate.
So one of the things we are dealing with in risk management and civil litigation involving officers, the price of poker has gone up. When I started 33 years ago, a big verdict was like $1 million, and now then afterwards it went up to 3 to 5, and then it went 5 to 10. And at some point it just skipped from, right over 15 and went to 20, and now literally it's $30 million. And the big areas of focus in particular tend to be use of force, dealing with the mentally ill, and pursuits. So in sitting there defending officers and recognizing the difficulty that they have under pressure, part of my mission is to help them tell their story. And when I talk about telling their story, I mean telling the truth. So in particular with regard to dealing with the mentally ill, what we've seen is an inability of officers to feel comfortable and articulate appropriately how they were trained. There have been cases, in fact, where officers made decisions in the field and then they were asked, for example, officer, were you trained to deal with the mentally ill? So I ask officers that question, right? How would you answer the question about what were you taught, right, with regard to dealing with people who are mentally ill? So that's how I came up with the Crisis Communications Crate. After the Constitutional Law Crate was so well received in the force equation, I was an officer for 8 years, but I didn't have any exceptional training on dealing with the mentally ill any more than an officer back in the day, because I'm old, so to speak. So I reached out and pulled like 30 people together, and we worked on this for 2 years, looking at what officers are taught. And what I discovered was officers receive a lot of training about dealing with the mentally ill, of course, from the basic academy through their FTO program and service, advance, and briefing trainings. We receive a lot of training about dealing with the mentally ill. But unfortunately, when you ask them to articulate it, they're like, yeah, I don't know, and I don't recall, and I don't want to be here, right? Right? So that's how we got to the Crisis Communications Crate. So the overall concept with the crate is, starts with the lid. And the lid, crisis, is an articulation of what we do. We provide a concerned response. Officers go on all calls to help people, whether the help is because somebody is being hurt and they need, that situation made safe, or because somebody is hurting themselves. We provide a concerned response. We show up and we're trying to help. We try to intervene safely. We try, right, to intervene safely based on the information we have and the statutes and laws that apply. I had a case where an officer was involved in an incident where he ultimately ended up shooting someone who came at his throat with a knife. And the officer ended up shooting that person as the knife is like right here, right? And plaintiff's counsel, starts the deposition and says, basically, officer, were you trained to deal with someone who's mentally ill? And the officer, given that scenario that I just related to you, wanted to say, yeah, I was taught if somebody comes at me with a knife to my throat, I shoot them, right? But that officer looked at that attorney and said, yes, I was trained to provide a compassionate response. Well, it wasn't concerned response, but I'll take it, right? I mean, and, the idea is for that officer to go into that confrontational situation, a deposition, and be prepared to articulate what they implement from what they've learned, and that core concept there is amazing. Crisis. The exterior of this crate is the based on the LD37, which is the Basic Academy Learning Domain, the workbook series. Now, why that happens is because plaintiff's counsel use these expert witnesses who take your Basic Academy training, which might have been 30 years ago, right? And they use that as the basis to question you about how you did your job. And so they have this written document that they can use to interrogate you about what you're trained to do. So I took LD37, SB29, which is the FTO mandated 8-hour training program that Post had to implement, and SB11, which is a non-funded, non-mandated additional mental health training that's been created, but that was because of the legislation was put in place. And I took all of that and said, what is the core information from those documents, that material, that officers are going to be questioned about whether they know and understand and use that information. And I made 11 flashcards of information, formed it into a crate, right? So the exterior of this crate is c.r.i.s.i.s, my favorite television show, by the way. Nature, causes, indicators, and stigma, which are core concepts in dealing with the mentally ill. Officers being able to articulate what is the nature of the different types of disabilities that you've been trained to deal with. Intellectual, mental health issues, physical, and developmental. What is that form? For me, we use acronyms to enable officers to feel empowered to provide information in response, articulating what they've actually learned. They learned it all, but can they explain it, right? I'm a PhD. I'm a JD, but I'm a PhD is intellectual, mental health, physical, and developmental disabilities. Awesome. See how easy that is?
Yeah.
And it's really difficult to trip you up when you got the answers, right? So nature, causes, indicators, and stigma, there's ways to deal with each one of those as far as if you want to dig down in the subparts, right? The real core of this this crate is the inside. So the inside is tact, tone, atmosphere, communications, and time. TACT is a mental health acronym that is used to teach mental health concepts, and it's commonly used. And hopefully officers can remember that. By the way, when I ask officers and their trainers what they learned from mental health training, typically I get a crickets type of answer. It's really scary. So we're doing 40 hours of training, and you finish a 40-hour program. 2 weeks later, if I ask you what did you learn, what are you going to say? Well, hopefully now you're going to say I was trained to provide a concerned response to intervene safely based on the information I have and the statutes and laws that apply. Well, if they go further, they ask you to break that down. What would you say? What were you taught? And commonly this is phrased in de-escalation terms, which is a big concept currently. It's a big attack mode for plaintiffs' lawyers, criminal defense lawyers. Officer, why didn't you de-escalate the situation? Well, the bottom line is de-escalation requires cooperation. You cannot de-escalate someone unless they cooperate. So how do we get people to cooperate? Well, in particular, it's our communication skills, right? So that's where the please Papa Smile comes in. So please breaks down to your communication skills. Patience, listen, be empathetic, be attentive, use simple statements, and be aware of your eye contact and body language. Now I'm going to tell you, Doug, please is really, really easy for officers to remember. That last E takes a little bit of work. But when we teach them to remember that communication is 70 to 85% nonverbal, they go, oh yeah, that's that E, right? Eye contact, body language. So then the Papa Smile is the concepts of active listening skills. Now, by the way, all of this stuff is taught in these programs. The problem is we gave it to officers and said, there'll be a test, right? It'll be your deposition in 30 years. And we gave them no way to recall it. So Papa Smile is a breakdown of the active listening skills. Pop, pause. We show up in a crisis, right? Slow things down if we can, right? Right? Open-ended questions. Hey, buddy, what's going on? Talk to me. Because getting somebody to talk is a self-de-escalation venting opportunity. And not yes-no questions, not closed-ended questions, open-ended questions, right? Hey, what's going on? Tell me. Looks like you're having a bad day. What's happening? Talk to me, buddy, right? Paraphrase is the second P. What is that? You paraphrase back to them what they just said, right? Right? Paraphrase as in use their own words, right? And so you're talking to them about what just happened. Pop A. A is awareness of hooks and triggers. So you're talking to the guy and he starts to get really agitated when his mom walks in the room. Okay, Mom, maybe you want to stay outside for, right? Or you start, you see his dog's there, right? And you say, hey, I like your dog. I have a dog. Tell me about your dog. That's a hook, right? As in get him to talk to you. Smile is then summarizing back to him everything you learned. Mirror is the M, is about mirroring his actions. If he's pacing, maybe you pace with him, but you don't pace as far as he goes, or you know, there's a lot of different mirroring techniques. I, the pronoun I, is about him understanding you're engaged. It's called I messages.
Mm-hmm.
I think what you're telling me is you're afraid. And then the L falls right in line with that. It's label emotions.
Right.
I think what you're telling me is you're having a bad day. You seem angry. Tell me why you're angry. Or you seem afraid. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And the final letter, E, is encourage and reassure them that everything's going to be fine. Now, Doug, if you think about in a crisis, please pop a smile. This is stuff that our officers do all the time.
Right.
The issue is, can they tell their story, right? And that's really key. But also when it doesn't go perfectly, and somebody's accusing you of failing, which is unfortunately something we have to deal with, then you can explain how you tried to do your job. You went in there with a plan. Mm-hmm. We always show up with a plan. We have a commonality of training from basic academy through FTO programs, across the board. An officer from California and Nevada meet at the border to deal with an incident. They have a plan because they have a common basis of training, right? And your plan in dealing with, somebody who's mentally ill, who's having a bad day, who's in a crisis. Can you explain that?
Yeah, great learning tools. Incredible work that you've done to help police officers be safer on the streets, successful in their careers. Really appreciate all of the good things that you do, Missy.
Thank you, Doug. I'm blessed to do what I do.
Doug Wyatt, Police Magazine.